Hello and welcome to everyone today for our live cast on the presentation of our 20th caliber. 20th caliber in 17 years at MB&F. It is an incredibly important moment for all of us at MB&F. I think when you'll discover it, you'll see that it's also a pretty important moment for our industry. And for sure, it's a monumental moment for Stephen McDonnell and for myself. Now, some of you already know Stephen McDonnell. He is the brilliant mind who brought us the legacy Perpetual. He single-handedly had the idea, constructed it over 4 years, and brought us that caliber. Since then, he's worked for the last 5 years on this new piece we call the Sequential. And it is, I don't have any words to present it. We will explain it to you over the next half an hour. I have to tell you that I'm pretty used to talking in public, but I'm pretty nervous. I'm nervous because already digitally, we are on a live cast where I am here in Dubai. And Stephen has flown in from Belfast in Geneva. The studio is in Geneva. Stephen is with us. How are you feeling? How are you doing, Stephen?
No, I'm 100%. I'm ready for this, Max. This day has been a very long time coming, so I'm absolutely geared up. Can't wait.
Cool. Now a little bit of housekeeping. This is on YouTube. All of you can listen, but you can also ask questions. To ask questions live, you have to be registered on YouTube or on Google. And then there is a part where you can actually type in the questions. Unfortunately, neither Stephen or I can actually see the questions as we are talking. Then our team at the studio will send them to us, at least to me, on my phone. And at the end of the presentation, we will take questions and answer as many as we can. Where do I start? I think my family and everyone who's worked with me can tell you that I am not the right guy to celebrate. I very rarely know how to celebrate. I probably don't live enough in the present. I'm working on that, still not there. And I definitely don't look back. Sometimes I look at my wife and I think, oh, I sort of just met her. And then I realized we have a 5-year-old and a 9-year-old daughter, and that probably has been more than a few days. And so when my team at the end of last year mentioned to me, you know, Stephen's caliber, which is coming out in May next year, is our 20th caliber, I fell off my chair. How could it be that in such a short time, we've done 20 calibers? It seems to me, honestly, that it was just yesterday, it was 2005, July, that I was incorporating the company with my little savings and working from my flat for the first 2 years, nearly going bankrupt in the process. And in November of that year, I was going around the world with a few drawings of my HM1 and actually of my HM2 also, to see retailers. You can see the HM1 here drawings, the original I did with my good old friend Eric Giroux, who's accompanied us over these last 17 years. And actually it's interesting, if we see the HM2, is that originally MB&F was going to be a watch brand where all the cases were going to be as an 8. And luckily for me, and I think for everybody, I changed my mind at the end of 2005 and said, no, every single machine will be a completely different machine. And that's the beginning of all the horological machines. So when I look back, I realized that the risks I took in those days were humongous. And I probably wouldn't take them today. It was a leap of faith, complete leap of faith. So what made me do that? What made me abandon everything and create this crazy creative lab? Well, first of all, and that's very clear, to try and remain true to myself as a creator. I'd been creating watches, and I love creating watches, for the larger public, trying to create products which would sell a lot, which would please a lot. And definitely that was the end of that. I wanted to be able to create what I believed in, those 3D kinetic arts pieces which give time, and not care if anybody actually liked them. And probably as importantly, I wanted to stay true to my parents' values. The famous good thoughts, good words, good deeds that my mother kept on telling me when I was growing up. I wanted to make sure that actually happened in my professional life as much as in my personal life. Hence the brand was called MB&F, Maximilian Büsser and Friends. More importantly, in the why, because I think it's so important to know the why of what you do, was to be proud. That the last day of my life, when I look back, I can actually say, I'm proud of what we achieved. And I think 17 years later, looking back, I think we all at MB&F are pretty proud of what we have achieved. So how is that possible? Because on paper, one guy putting a little bit of savings, which are by far not enough, into a company creating insane 3D kinetic art pieces which give time when nobody's actually wanting anything like that, should not happen, and definitely not be able to create 20 calibers auto-financed in the next 17 years. What happens? The friends, what we call the friends. All the artisans, all the watchmakers, the engineers, the creatives, of course, all the team at MB&F. I was all alone in my flat 17 years ago. We're 38 now in the team. And of course, all the retailers who believed in us, who supported us, who presented what we did. And of course, all the clients who were crazy enough to believe in us and buy one of our pieces. Now, already today, we're incredibly grateful when a client buys a piece, but you have to imagine 15 years back, we were looking at them like, seriously? You want to buy a piece? And so I just wanted to use these few minutes to say thank you. Thank you, and that we're so grateful to all of you. So what have we done in these last 17 years? What are these 20 calibers? If you look at the image you've got in front of you, it makes no sense whatsoever. There is no clearly business strategy, no product strategy. This is chronologically what you're seeing. And you realize that at MB&F, it's always been about, let's do what we really love, and we'll see if there's a client. Let's do it as best as we can, and we'll see if we can actually make it happen. The MB&F 20 calibers, each of them take 2 to 4 years to develop. So that means we've done 1 to 2 every year. That means that it's like a layered cake. We're every time developing 3, 4, 5, 6 calibers in parallel. And every time a watch is sold, we can take a piece of that finance and finance the next caliber. That's how it's always worked, auto-finance from the beginning. So there are 11 horological machines. The horological machines are the foundation piece. If you look at my first piece, the HM1, it's actually 2 worlds coming together, and the heart is beating there. It was very philosophical. It was actually a movement built like a human being. There were the barrels on each side. There were the lungs. The heart was at the center. The hands were in the sides. And then I slid into pretty much a psychotherapy where I revisited pretty unwittingly my childhood, spaceships, cars, planes, etc. And every time, what was important was wouldn't it be cool if? I think what's defined our horological machines of all these years was, wouldn't it be cool if? If we didn't start that way, we didn't do the product. What most people look at is just that they've got these crazy shapes. You have to understand their incredible watchmaking behind. And many people don't understand that. And they started understanding when we came out with the legacy machines. So 2011, we came out with legacy machine number 1. And we just celebrated the 10 years of legacy machine. And it was a a different point of view, a different creative process. It was our way of saying thank you to the great master watchmakers of the 18th and 19th century. So initially it was about the thank you, but then it evolved in let's make them proud. Let's take what they did and bring it to another level. And I don't think there's any product in those 9 or 8 up till today which made more impact than the legacy machine Perpetual that Stephen McDonnell created for us. That movement single-handedly was a revolution in the world of perpetual calendars. And so Stephen has accompanied us actually much more than what people realize. In 2007, so remember I created the brand in 2005, in 2007, my company was nearly bankrupt because the supplier who was actually supposed to assemble the movements for us for my first HM1, I say us, I was all alone in the company, decided not to. Early January 2007, Peter Spiekmarin called 5 of his friends, and said, look, my friend Max is in trouble, can you help him? 5 watchmakers who arrived next 10 days, and amongst them was Stephen. These heroic 5 watchmakers are going to save MB&F before we even managed to deliver one piece. It took them 5 months to assemble that first HM1. Normally it would take a week and a half for many, many reasons. There were errors in construction, had to be redone. There were errors in parts. Stephen, who was at that time a professor at the WOSTEP, during evenings and nights was remaking every part by hand so that we could assemble those pieces. And of course, trying to understand how this movement was assembled without the assembly plans. In June 2007, we were able to deliver the first 2 pieces, and I avoided bankruptcy by that. Again, thank you so much to all 5, and of course, thank you to Stephen. So that's 2007. Then Stephen, at some point, leaves his job as a professor and starts his real dream, which is to create movements. And he's creating a movement for a brand, which unfortunately in 2011 has some financial difficulties and has to stop the project. Peter calls me up, says, you know that Stephen is in trouble. We drive up to Neuchâtel, go and see him and say, how can we help you? And in the conversation, he says, well, I have an idea for a perpetual calendar. It's like, no, please, anything but not a perpetual calendar, they don't work. And he said, there's a reason to that. The construction doesn't make any sense. And from there onwards, 4 years later, he's going to work single-handedly and create that incredible movement. 2015, it comes out. 2016, it gets the Grand Prix d'Horlogerie of Geneva. And we're invited by Dubai Watch Week, Stephen and I, to do a presentation. So Dubai Watch Week was still a very small event in those days. So Stephen comes to Dubai and we do the presentation together. And in the evening, I take him out to dinner. And I just won an auction at Christie's on what I found absolutely stunning pocket watch from Tiffany, which you can see here, which is a split-second chronograph. And I'm so enthusiastic, and I'm showing him on my phone, like, what do you think of that? And Steve looks at me and basically doesn't say much, goes, he's clearly not very impressed. And that's the beginning of a whole new story. So now I'm going to let Stephen tell you probably why he wasn't impressed and what was in his mind about chronographs at that time. All yours, Steve.
Well, it's not that I wasn't impressed. I mean, it's a beautiful watch, Max. You know, and you did a great job there picking that up. It's lovely, of course, it's lovely. But I think I was whenever I saw it. I mean, of course, it's great, and that's fine. But the chronograph is yet another example of a sort of a complication, which it's been around for a long time, and in 100, 150 years, it hasn't really evolved. Nobody's done anything with it. Nobody's made it any more interesting, And there's loads of scope to develop it, like there was with the perpetual calendar. So it seemed to me that, okay, that your pocket watch is very nice, but it carries with it exactly the same technical flaws and sort of limited functionality that all other conventional chronographs have, So I saw the watch, and of course it was nice, but I had at that point in the back of my mind an idea for what has become the watch that we're looking at today. And it was funny because at the time I already had the idea for at least a year, but I hadn't mentioned to MB&F the idea because there was always, Max had always said right from the very start, we would talk about watches, and he would say, oh, MB&F, MB&F will never do a watch with a seconds hand. We don't do seconds hands, not for us. So the idea I had was for a watch with 2 seconds hands. So I thought, well, I mean, clearly this idea will never be an MB&F idea. So I didn't bother to really discuss it with him. But here we are then, having our dinner in Dubai, and he showed me his chronograph, you know, and he's all excited about it. And I thought, well, you know, okay, if you want to if you want to discuss chronographs, then you know this is what I think about it, you know, and I sort of put it to him, well, okay, if you really want to pursue chronographs, this is what I would suggest. This could be a chronograph which I would say is actually interesting, you know, and because it does this, that, and the other, and because it solves all these problems, I think this really is. If you want to tackle chronographs, you really have to tackle them like this. So I mean, I didn't expect him really that it would go any further. As I say, 2 seconds hand. He didn't want to do seconds hands, but you know, the idea evolved, and here we are today. It's interesting because the origin of the idea really, I'm quite interested in sports timing, and the origin of the idea comes from from the concept of sports timing. So if you go back 100 or 110 years, something like that, that was an era when things like motor racing was emerging as a big thing, and technically people had to find ways to time flying laps. But what I mean is, if you're going to do 5 laps, even if you're running or you're cycling or you're driving or whatever, you're going to do 5 flying laps, which means that you don't stop or pause between lap 1, lap 2, etc. You have to find a way to time lap 1 and then immediately reset things and time lap 2 and so on. So if you consider how that would work, you know, with a conventional chronograph, a conventional chronograph has got a start-stop button and a return to 0 button. So that means that, okay, I start my chronograph at the beginning of lap 1, that's very good, and then lap 1 goes through. But at the end of lap 1, as the person passes the start-finish line, what I would have to do is stop my chronograph, record the time for lap 1, reset the chronograph to 0, and then restart it at the beginning of lap 2. And I'd have to do all that simultaneously and instantaneously, which clearly is completely impossible. So the conventional chronograph, yeah, it's fine, but it's really very limited in what it can do. So it was the interest in sports timing is what sort of inspired. And the picture you saw there just a second ago, this is actually how the problem would have been solved at the time. You'd physically have 2 or more stopwatches or chronographs, and they're physically mounted on a big frame with a great big lever. I mean, it's brilliant. And so at the end, so you'd start one of those watches at the start of lap 1, and then at the end of lap 2, you'd physically press the big lever, and they will, you know, one will stop, and simultaneously another one will start. So the functionality is there. The problem is if you wear that big thing on your wrist, it's not good. You won't be able to get your shirt down over it, you know. So it's not ideal. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to take the functionality of that. The other problem with that system, of course, is that you've got multiple watches, and the problem is that you can never be certain that that watch A and watch B are going to run at exactly the same rate. So there's an inherent error in that system because of the fact that it's different watches. So I wanted to take the sort of the functionality take what this does, but combine the functionality into a single watch and have it in such a way that we don't have different movements. We've got a single movement and a single escapement and a single oscillator. So yes, we have 2 chronographs, but the 2 chronographs ultimately are having their time base set by a single oscillator. So if you like, the chronographs converge and operate only with a single oscillator, which is in the case of this watch, it's the big flying balance, which you'll see which is the DNA of all of the legacy machine watches. So that's grand. So yeah, okay. So I had the idea. I didn't really mention it to MB&F, and then we had our dinner, grand, and then I told Max about it, and he was sort of skeptical a wee bit at first, but you know, I suppose here we are. So that's it, you know. So just talk just a wee bit about the functionality, and then I'm going to hand back to Max. So I think the first question to be really clear about is what is a chronograph, and so a chronograph is a basic movement. It's like any other. It's like the simplest movement you can think of. So, you know, just a watch that tells the time. That's fine. Every chronograph has got just that basic gear train, barrel, gear train, escapement, and oscillator. It has those key elements. But then what we do with a chronograph is that we add a second mechanism. So there's a chronograph mechanism which is sort of superimposed on the basic mechanism, and it has to have a system which will allow the chronograph system to be connected to and disconnected from the basic movement. The basic movement is running all the time. Your watch never stops. It's always running. So, but you have to be able to disconnect and connect and disconnect this chronograph system, and it's in doing that really is that's the key to what's going on here, and it's also one of the inherent problems in the conventional system. So it's a link which can be made and severed. The conventional chronograph uses a thing called a lateral clutch, and I'm going to show you some pictures here. And this is me operating an iPad, and so my 2 daughters and son will be mightily impressed at this because they will know that this is far from my comfort zone. So here we go. So here's a really classic sort of conventional chronograph, and if you the big wheel in the center is the chronograph wheel. We're looking at the movement side here, so you have to imagine the dial sides and the hands are on the other side of the watch. So the big wheel in the center, that's the chronograph wheel. It's the wheel which carries the seconds hand, and over at this bit here, you can see that there's a wheel on the top and a wheel down here. So that's the chronograph wheel, and this wheel up at the top here, that's the clutch wheel. So physically, what happens is whenever you engage the chronograph, this wheel drops down and its teeth engage with the chrono wheel. And then whenever you switch the chronograph off, it lifts up and the teeth disengage. So it's a physical engagement and disengagement of teeth. So it works fine, but one of its main problems is that whenever you make this engagement, the engagement happens very rapidly, and quite often it can make the seconds hand jump right at the start. So you get this movement which shouldn't be there. So even at the moment of pressing start, you already have an error introduced into the thing, which is sort of far from ideal. The other problem is that you've got in this system you have, as I said, the main gear train, and the chronograph system is a branch off to the side. It's not part of the main gear train. It's off on a little limb by itself, and it doesn't lead anywhere. The main gear train is all under tension because whenever you wind the watch up, you wind your watch with a big mainspring, and so the whole gear train's under tension. But the chronograph part, because it doesn't drive anything else, it's there by itself. It's not under any tension. Because it's not under any tension, you will have a problem that the hand, what we want is that we want the chronograph seconds hand, we want it to move smartly. With every beat of the watch, we want the hand to advance. So it advances in a very logical way. Because there's no tension in the gear train, if you leave the hand to itself, it'll flop and flutter about the dial. So this is completely unacceptable. So in order to create an artificial tension, we use, what the conventional chronograph uses a sort of a friction spring, which works, but it's a very inelegant solution. So I've got here we go. So this is the same watch, and so what we've done is we've removed the chronograph wheel, and this thing that you can see here in the middle, this long thing that sticks up, this is the friction spring now revealed. You can't really see it very clearly. You can't see it at all in that image, but here you can see the friction spring. And so the friction spring, he's pressing upwards against that chronograph wheel, and it's like applying a brake to the chronograph wheel. So it gives the chronograph wheel a tension. There's another picture here. There's the spring itself really close. You can see it now. So it's sticking up. It's a thin spring, and it's pressing the wheel up. And then there's a picture of the wheel. So there's the wheel in place, and you see the spring underneath like that. So it's if you like, it does the job. It does solve the problem, but in solving the problem, it creates a second problem, and that's the whole issue with it. Because in doing this, you're applying a brake to the whole watch. So what that means is that the friction spring consumes a huge amount of energy. So that means you will always find in a conventional setup that whenever you start the chronograph, the amplitude of the balance will drop by something like 30 degrees because all this energy is being wasted by the friction spring. So it works, but it's very imperfect. The other thing which is a problem is the minute counter itself. So okay, back to the original watch. So there's the seconds wheel, the seconds hand, all that sort of stuff. And the minute counter wheel is over here. So if you imagine on the other end of that shaft is the little hand which gives you the minutes. So he's controlled by a jumper spring, which is this thing here. So the minute counter stays still for 58 seconds out of 60, and then for the last 2 seconds he's jumped forward by the advancing mechanism. The spring has to be here in order to hold the wheel still. Otherwise, it'll just move around and it won't stay. We want it to stay. But it's exactly the same thing. The chronograph, the basic movement has to overcome not only the friction spring in the chronograph wheel, but it has to overcome the jumper spring and the minute counter. That means you have a second, even bigger dip in amplitude. If you watch what's happening with the amplitude of the watch, whenever it comes to the minute counter being advanced, you will see the amplitude drops and then comes back up again. That's why you'll always find in a conventional chronograph that if you just leave it running and let it run down by itself with the chronograph switched on, it will always stop at the moment it's trying to jump the minute counter because it uses up so much energy. So, I mean, it's fine, it works. The other thing is that because you have this difference in two states, that's the inherent key characteristic of the classic chronograph, is you have two different states of energy. Amplitude higher when the chronograph's off, and then reduced amplitude when the chronograph's running. This is, obviously it affects the power reserve, but it also means you can have two different rates of the watch, because if the isochronism of the balance isn't perfect, you'll find that actually, as soon as you switch the chronograph on and the amplitude goes down, the rate changes as well. So you're talking here about a watch which is its whole modus operandi is to be used with high precision to measure periods of time precisely, yet its actual rate, its time base is changing whenever you switch on the measuring system. So there's a huge load of things about the old chronograph which didn't please me. I wanted a watch which I wanted to solve all those problems, and I wanted to have all this functionality of the two chronographs. It's clear that if you have those limitations are very annoying in the conventional chronograph, but if I just use a conventional chronograph system and put it in this watch with two chronographs, all those losses will be doubled. And that would be simply unacceptable. The actual performance of the watch would be so poor, you couldn't use it at all. It's useless. So I wanted to have all the functionality, the two chronographs, but I also want a watch which, whether I have 0, 1, or 2 chronographs engaged, I've got exactly the same amplitude all the time. That's what I set out to sort of aim for, and thus the legacy machine Sequential was born. So now we're going to hear from Max and maybe see something.
So 2016 in November, we're having this talk. I didn't understand everything because I actually didn't realize, and that's bad of me, this whole issue of the performance of a chronograph actually dipping at the moment where you need it. So Stephen said, look, give me a bit of time. And he came back to us early 2018 with the design of the watch you're going to see. So not only the design, you're going to see two things. You're going to see 4 functions which have never happened so well, or even new functions in a chronograph. But on top of that, he solved the technical issue of not having any more amplitude issues when the chronograph is working. So it's a double revolution what he's come up with. That was early 2018. We're 4 years later, and we can finally unveil the legacy machine Sequential. So allow me to show you that piece now. This is the back of the movement. It's, even if I say so, it's extraordinarily beautiful. You've got all the different depths and volumes, 2 barrels, power reserve indicator on the back. The angling, the anglage is really, we went all in, beautiful big angles, of course, all done by hand. The beautiful rose gold Châtenay, of course, the hand engraving. You can see those 2 incredibly large titanium wheels, which have been one of the biggest challenges in this movement. And I'll let Stephen explain that later on. That's for the movement. This movement is 585 components. It's a hand-winding chronograph, which has 4 different functions. So allow me now to show you the front. That is the Sequential. What do we have here? At the bottom, at 6 o'clock, the hours and minutes. That's the time. And actually everything is given to the chronographs. On the right, you've got 60 seconds and 30-minute counter. There, the chronograph of the right, you've got a start, stop, push button, and a reset, like any conventional chronograph. On the second side, on the left, you've got the same. They're symmetrical. 60 seconds, 30 minutes, same start, stop, and reset. But there's a 5th button. So these 2 chronographs are completely independent, and at the same time, they're linked. And we call this button the twinverter, the twin inverter. And so what does this button do? It actually inverts the function of the chronographs. So if you come back onto me, I'll try and explain that as easy as I can. These two chronographs, if both of them are stopped, you press the twinverter, both chronographs start. If both are working, whenever they are, wherever they both stop immediately. If one is working and the other one is not working, when you press the twinverter, the one which is working stops, the one which was not working starts. And thanks to that simple idea, but incredible implementation, we're able to have 4 different functions, which I'll try and explain now. So bear with me, because I will try and explain it to you while somebody in Geneva, in the studio, is actually playing with it on the video dome so that you can actually see it. This is a sequential in live. First function, 2 totally independent chronographs. You can start one, you're timing your eggs. You can start the second one, you're timing your spaghetti. Completely different timings. You can stop them whenever you want independently. You can reset them whenever you want. So it's actually the function of 2 separate chronographs. So you have 2 chronographs there. Now, the second function, what a split-second chronograph does, that famous pocket watch I showed Stephen 6 years ago. A split second does what? It's basically you've got a race where you've got 2 cars which start at the same moment, so you need to have both chronographs starting at exactly the same time. Here you press the twinverter, both chronographs will start at the same time. That's what a split second does. Most split second chronographs, unfortunately, except for one exception, have only 60 seconds on one of the counters and minutes on the other. In this case, you can stop when the first car passes the line, you can stop the first one, and the second car maybe arrives 10 seconds later, you stop the second one, and you have the 2 different timings completely clearly put on the dial. No split-second chronograph will give you that detail and such easy reading. So that's the second function. The third function is the sequential. It's called the sequential. It's the first chronograph ever which can allow you to count all the laps of a race. A car starts a race, you press the start of the chronograph, and when it goes at the end, that's what Stephen was starting to explain, at the end of the first lap, when you arrive at the end of the first lap, you normally need one chronograph to stop, to say, oh, what time was the first lap? And you start exactly at the same time, not a different, same time, the second chronograph, so that you have the time of the second lap. That's what we're going to try and show you here. So we start, the car starts its race. The right-hand chronograph is timing the first lap. You let the lap go around. Let's imagine it's a very fast lap. It's past the line now. You press the twinverter. You see that the right chronograph stopped, and exactly at the same time, the left one started. You have the time during that second lap to write down the time of your first lap, reset it, and wait for the car to pass the line again of that second lap. It passes now. The left chronograph gives you the time of the second lap, the third one is being timed, etc., etc. You can do a whole race, imagining that laps are not more than 30 minutes. I don't know any laps which last more than 30 minutes, where you can time the whole laps, all the laps of the whole race. That's never ever been done. And then there's a fourth function for those of you who are chess players. You know, when you play chess in a tournament, each player has a definitive time he can only use for his whole play. So if he takes 30 minutes for one move, well, maybe he'll have only 30 minutes left for all the other moves, if it's an hour. So you have to have an aggregator. And you see often in these tournaments, every time somebody plays, they press on a clock, which gives the time aggregated for that player. And actually, this chronograph does that. So bear with me. So it's my turn to play. I'm thinking, I do my first move, boom. You press the twin inverter. Now it's my opponent. My opponent's thinking, plays their move, press the twin inverter, but you don't set it back to 0, and now it starts aggregating. So here, you can see on the right, I'm still thinking my second move, I play my second move, and now it's the turn of my opponent for his or her second move, etc., etc. That's the fourth possibility. Pretty amazing, right? So those are the 4 functions. This watch, okay, les goûts et les couleurs, you say in French. You can love it or not aesthetically. I think it's absolutely stunning. It's not only incredible in function, as Stephen was explaining, he had to find all the watchmaking solutions to make this actually happen. And I'm going to actually now let Stephen explain to you what were all the challenges he had in trying to make this come to life.
Challenges, yeah, that's right. Thank you, Max. So I'm gonna give a few details about some of the technical features and talk a little bit about, without boring everybody to tears. We'll have a bit of chat about this and then see what happens after that. So the basic parameters of the watch. The balance oscillates at 3 hertz. That means it's 6 beats per second. The power reserve is officially announced at 72 hours, although it will actually run for quite a bit longer than that. It's got 59 joules. That's all fine. So we're talking about 2 completely independent chronograph systems, which are both double button chronographs. That means, as you saw earlier, each has got a start, stop, and a return to 0 button, and both are controlled independently by column wheels. So on my image here, again, we're back to the old iPad. So the column on the image. What I've done here is this is just directly off my CAD model, which I used to design the movement. So what I've done is I've taken off the dials and I've taken off the balance. It's completely invisible. I've taken off the big balance bridge. So what you see is this is what's underneath, really. And this is the actual chronograph mechanisms themselves. So we've got, on the right-hand side, we've got, as you see, one chronograph seconds counter, minute counter, and then the left-hand side, the same seconds, minutes. So the column wheels are these guys here. If you look at the thing highlighted in light blue, so the column wheels, every time you start or stop either of the chronographs, the column wheels, they advance by 1 increment. So it's interesting because the 2 systems are perfect mirror images of each other. So that means that the column wheel on the right, whenever you start or stop the system, the column wheel turns clockwise. The one on the left, whenever you start or stop, the column wheel turns anti-clockwise. So they're exactly the same, but mirror images of one another. So 2 column wheels, double button chronographs. That's exactly the situation. Each of the chronographs has its own gear train, which is quite interesting. So you've got, each chronograph has its own barrel, it's got its own gear train, but what is very important is that for this accuracy feature, the two gear trains converge on the same escape wheel pinion. So if you look down here, you can see this is one of the, I'm going to talk about the vertical clutch in a minute. This is one of the clutches. This is the other clutch. Then you've intermediate wheels here and here. But what you see is that there's a single escape wheel and a single lever, and then the balance is obviously there, but you don't see it in this image. So because the 2 gear trains converge on the same oscillator, they're timed from the same oscillator, therefore there is absolutely no difference in timing rate between chronograph A and chronograph B. So that assures the sort of the timing aspect. Then, of course, as you've seen, the 2 chronographs are linked by the twin inverter system, which effectively what I'm doing with a twin inverter is that it's these levers here. Really, it's these levers here. These levers are connected to the button at 9 o'clock. And what happens is that whenever you press the button, effectively, it's like pressing start and stop of both chronographs simultaneously. It's like pressing the start and stop at 2 o'clock for the one and the one at 10 o'clock for the other one. Pressing those, what the button is doing, it's doing the same action as actually pressing the buttons together. So what it does is it advances both column wheels simultaneously, the one on the right clockwise and the one on the left anti-clockwise. So that's what the twin inverter is actually doing. Now, all of this business is made possible by the vertical clutch, which is these things, the two clutches. Each, as I say, each chronograph has its own clutch. I'm going to talk a wee bit about the clutches now, because it's important to understand that the clutch is the feature in the watch which makes the whole thing possible. Without the, and it's interesting because it's in a way there's an analogy with the mechanical processor that I come up with for the perpetual calendar, you know, the legacy machine perpetual. There again, it's a complicated sub-assembly which enables the watch to happen. Without that, there couldn't be you just couldn't do. There's no other way around that problem to solve to get a watch to do those things. And similarly with this watch, the dual vertical clutch is the key to making this watch possible. So yeah, so I'm going to look at the clutch a wee bit. So the first thing to understand is sort of what is a clutch. You know, I know it's a word which is familiar, but effectively a coaxial clutch like this, what you've got is you've two elements. So one element is moving all the time, is rotating all the time, and another element can be linked and disconnected from the part which is moving all the time. So what that means is that whenever the chronograph is running, I link these two together, and everything moves. The chronograph, if you like, there's a seconds wheel part, which is the basic movement, which is running all the time, and then a chronograph part, which only turns when I switch my chronograph on. So whenever I switch the chronograph on, I join these two together, and everything moves as one. The entire clutch moves. When I disengage the chronograph, these two separate. The lower wheel, which is part of the main gear train, continues to turn because it has to turn. If it stops, the watch stops. It turns all the time, but I've severed the link, and then that means the chronograph itself stops. So that's what we're doing when you actually press the start and stop buttons. So the clutch itself, as I say, complicated sub-assembly. I've got an image or two here, which I'm going to attempt to. Okay, yeah. So how do we look at this, right? This is the clutch itself. The lower part, which is all highlighted in red, the lower part is the basic movement. It's effectively the seconds wheel. So that bit is turning all the time, and then whenever I switch the chronograph on, everything else, the top bit which you see here in the heart, that's the return to zero cam, and also the pinion at the bottom. All those bits turn when I switch the chronograph on, but when I stop the chronograph, only the part highlighted in red continues to turn, which is the basic movement part. So I'm linking and disengaging the basic movement to the chronograph system. That's what's actually happening. How that works is that if I hide the lower part of the clutch, which is the seconds wheel, if I hide that bit, this is what you're left with. So if we make that orange wheel disappear, you can see that there's a long shaft. So everything you see here in this image, this is chronograph only. This turns as a single unit, and it turns when the chronograph's running. When the chronograph stops, nothing here moves at all. So that's what's actually happening now. What that means is that when the chronograph is stopped and the seconds wheel continues to turn, the pivoting of the seconds wheel actually pivots about the very long shaft that you can see in the image here. You know, the pivoting points are at the top and at the bottom. So this is staying still, and now the seconds wheel is turning around this big long shaft. The only way to get this to work properly is to actually incorporate jewelling into the wheel itself. Now, normally jewels are pressed into a bridge or into a main plate, as you see them. You know, you see the red stones when you look at any watch. And the jewels are always static. The jewels aren't moving around. They're always static in the bridge of the main plate. In this case, the jewels have to be fitted into the wheel itself. And so that means the jewels themselves are actually now mobile. They move with the wheel. And this is totally pivotal to it, because without this jewelling aspect, the friction, whenever you stop the chronograph, the friction would go up enormously, and the watch would run terribly with the chronograph stopped. So how this is done is this jewelling business is, what I did was I actually set the jewel into the pinion itself. So we're now looking at the seconds wheel. So this is the bit, the seconds wheel invisible here. You see the seconds wheel there. We're now looking at the part highlighted in red only. So it's another sub-assembly. So you can see that the jewel has been set into the top of the pinion. Now the problem with this is that the pinion is in steel, and all jewels today, all jewels in watches they're friction fitted into, say, the bridge of the main plate. The bridge and main plate are always made in a relatively soft material like German silver or brass or whatever it may be. And there's a tolerance between the jewel and the hole. The jewel is effectively a few microns, a few thousandths of a millimeter larger than the hole. So whenever you press it in, it stays there. It doesn't drop out again, but it also doesn't break. The difference here is with steel. Steel is so much harder. It's not possible to friction fit jewels into steel. You just can't do it. If the hole's a tiny bit too large, it'll just be loose and fall out again. And if the hole's a tiny bit too small, the jewel will just break as soon as it touches the steel. So it can't be done in this case. So I had to find a way to jewel something which can't be jeweled. And it was only in doing that that the clutch can actually work, and then we solve the problem. So the way to do that, actually, if we take a closer look, this is now the center of the wheel. What you can see is that there's the jewel in the center, and the jewel has got a sort of a conical edge, and there's a very thin wall of metal around the conical edge. And what happens is when you drop the jewel in, you then spin the whole thing, and you press the thin wall with a very hard, polished burnisher, and it folds the wall down over the jewel and keeps the jewel in position. And it's interesting because this is a technique called certissage, which has been around for a long time. So today we have the technology to make very accurate jewels, and the outer diameter is accurate to a couple of microns, and similarly the hole is accurate to a couple of microns. So you can have this friction fitting business I explained. But 100 years ago, it wasn't possible to make jewels with this accuracy. So in fact, all jewels, this is a pocket watch bridge, a vintage pocket watch bridge. All jewels traditionally, not only in steel, but even in German silver or brass, whatever the bridge was made out of, or the main plate, all jewels were set in this way. And you can see here in these examples, for example, the central one here, you can see that the soft wall has been folded down over the jewel. Similarly here, folded down. And that's how all vintage watches were jeweled. And so really, it's this old technique of certissage which enables the jewels to be set into the pinion, which enables the clutch to happen, which enables the watch to exist in the first place. So this business of the certissage is vitally important. Okay, there we are. So yeah, there we are. That's that. So the other thing I wanted to mention is the minute counter. The minute counter is interesting because it's a constant mesh system. Now, the first thing we did when we designed the watch is we lay out all the dials, and so that's what we did at the beginning. The seconds counters are here, the minute counters are up here, so on. You'll notice that it's interesting. If you look at a conventional chronograph, there's always a large seconds dial, and the minutes dial is always within the seconds. So if you think about how it's actually working, you have a very small distance between the axis of the seconds hand and the axis of the minute counter hand. They're always very close together. And in fact, that closeness is necessary because of the way the thing is constructed. You can't have them separated to a large distance. We laid the dials out in this, and we wanted to have completely separate minute and seconds dials. And in fact, it's not possible to do that with the conventional design of how the minute counter works. So that's why I had to, in order to facilitate this, I had to use these giant wheels, which you see in the reverse of the movement, and it's the giant wheels. They are actually the driving system for the minute counter, and they again allow us to have this very large distance between the minute counter axis and the seconds counter axis. So I think that again it completely changes the way this chronograph looks. Okay, so all of the stuff we've discussed, that allows me to have a chronograph which can have 0, 1, or 2 chronographs running, and there's no change in amplitude whatsoever between the states because we've solved the problem of the dueling. We've integrated the chronograph into the gear train, so there's no need for the friction spring. Then we've fixed the problem of the minute counter jumper by driving the minute counters directly with the geared system as opposed to the jumping spring. So there's no change in amplitude due to the seconds, no change in amplitude due to the minutes. Nothing's happening at all, which is going to bother us. So it's interesting. All those things had to be created so that this watch with the two chronographs together was possible. Without those various innovations, you just couldn't do this watch because all those losses would be overwhelming and the watch could not work well. But in creating all those innovations, the byproduct of that is that what we actually end up with is two chronographs which are fundamentally better than any other conventional chronograph which has been done up to this point, because it's now optimized in a way which hasn't been seen before. So the byproduct of the requirements to create this project has meant that we actually end up with a chronograph which is fundamentally better than anything which has gone before. So that's what happened, I suppose.
Thank you, Stephen.
There you go.
What an adventure. What an incredible 5 years. I know it's been tough, as it always is each time that you've created a movement. Yeah. It's, I don't think people who actually discover the movement or the watch today will realize all the turmoil you've gone through. And we know because we've been with you. And I think that's what most people should realize when they look at incredible watchmaking, is that they're human beings with great minds who've suffered to try and find solutions and try and create something which is not only technologically amazing, but which is beautiful. And we all at MB&F want to thank you for that. Now, if we come to the watch itself, I don't know if we have an image of the watch. There we go. We chose to put it in the legacy machine EVO line because it's a chronograph, and the EVO line is the watch which you can live with all the time. You can go swimming, you can do sports with. That means that also the movement is suspended on what we call the flex ring, which is this patented system. Before I go there, it's important to say that we have registered 5 patents, 75 pages of patents on all the innovations that Stephen has created for this movement. So the movement is suspended. The case is 80 meters water resistant, screwed down crown. And if we just can come back to the picture as if it's possible, something we didn't mention is you see that the balance wheel, contrary to all the other legacy machines which have got the balance wheel at the center of the movement, is slightly eccentered. The reason to that is because it would have completely masked the chronograph counters, and we didn't want that. And the balance wheel is slightly smaller than the original LM1, LM Perpetual 101, because it's a higher frequency movement. So typically our LMs are 18,000 oscillations an hour. This one has gone up to 21,600. Now, as Stephen said, this is also something which is being created for performance. He hasn't spent all that energy so that there's no drop of amplitude, so that we, at the other hand, we don't have enough precision. It's been an incredible story. Before we take the questions, we've just got a little film which will pass 2 minutes, and then we'll take all your questions. So thank you very much.
5 years of research, 585 components, a unique twin-verter binary switch, and internally jeweled chronograph clutch shafts. MB&F presents the legacy machine's Sequential EVO, a groundbreaking dual chronograph allowing an unprecedented combination of timing modes. When it was time to test our new machine, we embarked our team and friends and a couple of vintage cars, and we tested it our way. Function 1, Sequential mode, a lap timer that goes beyond any previous lap timer chronographs. Function 2, simultaneous mode, like a split-second chronograph, but better. Function 3, independent mode. Use the 2 chronographs totally separately to time any dissociated actions. LM Sequential EVO, 1 movement, 2 chronographs, multiple timing modes.
So there we are, we're back. We've got a few questions coming in. Actually a lot for you, Stephen. So I'm off the hook on most of them. So what was the toughest part of the development?
Without a doubt, it was the clutch. I'm not going to ramble on about the clutches, you know, but the clutch was an absolute nightmare to do, because there's a spring inside the clutch which creates the frictional link. It presses the ring down and joins the 2 halves together. And obviously, in a clutch, you want the link to be as strong as it can be. But the downside to that is that it makes it harder and harder for the actual operating system, for the levers that you saw under the dial. It makes it harder and harder for those levers to move, to actually do the engagement and disengagement. So there was an awful lot of work to optimize the spring and get it all to work properly. Because initially it was catastrophic. Whenever we actually built the prototype, and the prototyping, just to give you an idea, the prototyping ran last year from March to October, so it was like 8 or 9 months of absolute agony. And because initially the thing is incredible. You think, okay, if a clutch is going to slip, it's like a car. Think of a car. If your clutch is dodgy in your car and you try to drive uphill, the engine spins, but the wheels don't turn. So there's a slipping problem, you know. So this was a slipping problem. But and so you'd think, okay, if there's a slipping problem, what will happen is the clutch will lose time with respect to the basic movement. It will drop behind the basic movement, okay, because the basic movement's always run at exactly the right rate, and the clutch would slip behind. In fact, that's not what happened. What happened was the chronograph actually gained time on the basic movement, which initially I thought, you know, I'm literally losing my mind. This can't be possible, you know. So we had to try to improve the frictional contact of the clutch to get it to work properly. But what was happening was those great big wheels, to come back to those wheels which drive the minute counter, which we talked about, those great big wheels are massive, and the problem which that creates is that those wheels have got very high inertia. And you need to understand what's happening inside a watch. So that means that the gear train is normally static, but 6 times a second, the escapement opens the gate, allows the gear train to move. So the escapement accelerates, the gear train accelerates from 0 to maximum speed, and then the escapement shuts the gate, and the gear train is brought to a violent halt. And this happens 6 times a second. Each beat that you hear is the escapement closing the gate. So you have this very rapid acceleration and violent deceleration. And what was happening was those big wheels as well, they are also being accelerated and decelerated 6 times a second. And they've got so much inertia that what was happening was the wheels accelerate up to speed, okay, but then whenever the escapement closes the gate and the gear train stops, those big wheels kept turning, and the gearing of the teeth came around and clumped the back of the clutch teeth and actually made the clutch slip forwards, and so the chronograph gained time. So optimizing the clutch and then solving this issue with those wheels. Initially, those wheels were made in they were made in copper beryllium, and they were thicker and heavier than you see them now. And in the end, they had to be completely redesigned, much thinner, and made in titanium. And that reduced the inertia of those wheels by a factor of about 5, and then it all worked. So I explained that in 2 minutes there, but I mean that took months of agony of the thing not working properly. So that was there's the answer. The clutch, yeah.
A great question from Alfonso in Spain. What was more difficult to develop, Stephen? This chronograph or your perpetual? Tough one, huh?
Yeah, that's a good question. They were. It's hard to choose. They were different. They were difficult in completely different ways. The perpetual was difficult because when I actually, again, the prototyping, everything comes out in the wash. You see, you have to understand that even with the very best computer modeling of all the parts, you can't really know, because this is all sort of new ground in watchmaking, you can't really know what's going to happen or if it's going to work or not until you physically build it and try it all at the prototyping stage. So it means that there's months and months of excruciating waiting to see what's going to happen. The perpetual calendar, I knew there was initially an issue, and when I got to the prototyping, indeed there was an issue, and without solving this problem there would be no watch. And that was a situation where I tried everything I could and I couldn't get it to work, and I'd almost given. I mean, I was in the depths of despair, and then Monday morning I was sitting at my computer and the solution just magically dropped out of the sky into my head, and 3 hours later I had this one lever redesigned, and then once at that moment then it all worked fine. It was from that moment on we made the lever, we tried it, it worked straight away. That was it. We were then on the right road. The sequential chronograph was much more of a very slow and gradual slog to increment by increment solve these problems and get everything optimized. It wasn't one sort of magic eureka moment when after that everything was good. So that was they're very different projects, but both extremely challenging. Was one worse? I couldn't say. I think equally difficult.
I've got a follow-up, which I think is a really interesting and a tricky question for you, Stephen. Why do you think it took so long for those problems with chronographs and perpetual calendars to be addressed?
That's a very good question. I mean, I don't know. These things have. I think there is a lot. I think watchmaking can be, I don't know if I may say so, a bit complacent, and I think that there's maybe not necessarily. I think because things have been done a certain way for a very long time, people just continue to do things in the same way, and that seems to be fine. I think sometimes watchmaking as an industry maybe struggles a wee bit with innovation. There's plenty of room to do all sorts of new stuff. So I mean, why not do it? But I'm not really from the conventional watch world. You know, I'm not. you know, I'm not Swiss, and I don't really, I don't even live in Switzerland, you know, and I'm not really part of the industry. I live miles away, and I don't really follow what's going on in the watch industry. I don't read the journalism very much, and I don't follow what's going on, and I work according to what, I don't know, what interests me and what feels good. So why nobody else has looked at these things, I don't know. Once they're done, I think the mark of a good idea, I was discussing this earlier with somebody else, I think the mark of a good idea is that once the idea comes out, everything, oh, it was so obvious, you know, of course that, I mean, it's so obvious, you know, and this double, the sequential chronograph, the idea is really obvious. I mean, it's such obvious functionality. Of course you want to be able to do all these things with a chronograph, so why nobody has, maybe somebody has thought it, but it's a two-pronged thing. Thinking of the idea as one thing, yes, I'd like a chronograph to do all these different things and not have any loss in amplitude and not have any wasted energy, but finding the way to execute it is obviously that's the very difficult bit.
Yeah, definitely. A question for probably both of us, maybe more for you. Why did we choose 30-minute subdials and not 60 minutes? You want to address that?
Okay, well, in my case, it would be it's firstly an aesthetic thing and secondly a technical thing. So aesthetically, 30-minute subdials are extremely common, and if you look around at other chronographs, you know, both vintage and more modern, 30 is very common. It's very neat. It's also much more from a visual point of view. If you're the person owning and wearing the watch, you'll actually see the hand moving much more quickly. So there's a lot more to look at, and there's more going on. It makes the display more interesting. Whereas a hand which takes an hour to turn will move very, very slowly. And if you only start your chronograph for say a minute just to look at it, enjoy it, and watch all the things happening, that hand will barely move. You'll hardly see it move. So it makes it more interesting, the fact that the hand is more animated because it moves faster. The second thing is the technical thing. The gearing, those giant wheels on the back of the watch, I had to have the wheels as big as that in order to get a 30-to-1 reduction. So the clutch, which is integrated into the gear train, it takes the place of the seconds wheel in the gear train. A conventional non-chronograph watch, you'll have a seconds wheel, which is a wheel turns once per minute, and the vertical clutch replaces the seconds wheel in the actual gear train. So it's turning once per minute. The minute counter is turning once every 30 minutes. So you've got a 1 to 30 reduction between those two. It requires those big wheels just to get the 30-to-1 reduction. To get a 60-to-1 reduction, the wheels would have had to be even bigger, and it couldn't have been done. It wouldn't have been possible to do it in that way.
Absolutely. This one is for me, actually. What is the process to actually order this watch? Now, what I failed to say is that, so as you saw in the image, there is a orange baseplate version and a black baseplate version. They're not limited, and we're going to try and craft 35 movements a year. All in all, not 35 and 35, it's all in all about 35 movements. That's what we can do. So more or less 3 a month. Of course, we've got our 16 retailers around the world. Please contact them. We know, and we don't do this on purpose, we know that there will be most probably hundreds of people who will want to order one on the first week. It's just, as I've often explained, I don't want the company to grow. And we're creating new products every year, so we also have to stop other ones. But last year we crafted all in all 278 watches. This year we're hoping to do 350, which is a gigantic leap for us. And amongst them is those 35 chronographs. They will always be very difficult to have and to find. We don't do it on purpose. It is also because, as I've always explained, the company has no intention of growing its production. And there's actually a follow-up. Somebody's asking, noticing the reddish copper version is similar to the UAE edition split escapement. Is this a new aesthetic direction for the EVO line? Actually, it's that orange CVD, chemical vapor deposition, which we did already on the original perpetual EVO, where there were only 15 done. So we thought that we were going to do the orange was very much more sportier, and the black allowed you to change your straps. And actually it's interesting because they've got two completely different characters, these pieces. And les goûts et les couleurs, again, as they say in French, the tastes are all yours. So that's for that. And I've got a last question because I see that we've already gone over an hour. Where do I get that MB&F branded jacket, Max? So the film you saw with the old Lotus 11, who's driving it is Serge Kriknoff. my partner in the company, our CTO. He is the person who transforms our ideas into reality. He's the person who's assisted, of course, Stephen in the whole process. He's been working with us for 15 years now, and he's got a second passion in life, is racing vintage cars, and that's his Lotus 11, and he had that jacket made specifically for him. So we can't sell you that. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to say an enormous thank you, of course, to Stephen. It's we've basically accompanied you for 10 years now between the Perpetual and the chronograph, and we are looking forward to accompanying you for the next decades in the new ideas you have. I want to say an enormous thank you to the whole team all around it, because this is always a teamwork. And I want to say thank you to all of you who have listened in for the whole hour. We're open to questions at any time. You know us. You can send us DMs on Instagram. You can send us messages on LinkedIn. You can send us on Facebook, on everything, on emails, on WhatsApp. We try and answer everybody. And I have to say, it's a gigantic day for us. There's nothing which explains the emotion which is going through me at this moment. And I'm incredibly proud of the piece and of everyone. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Stephen. And hope to continue amazing you going forward. Thanks, guys.